Hello and welcome to the Common Ground News Service Celebrity Chat with Mona Eltahawy, and welcome, Mona.
Hi.
Thank you. Mona, I would like to start off by telling our listeners just a little bit about you. Mona Eltahawy is an award-winning journalist and an international public speaker on Arab and Muslim issues. She is based in New York and has spent quite a bit of time as a news reporter in the Middle East for many years, working in Cairo and Jerusalem as a Reuters correspondent. And she was also the first Egyptian journalist to live and work for a Western news agency in Israel. Her opinion pieces have been published frequently in the Washington Post and the International Herald Tribune, and she has appeared as a guest analyst in several media outlets. And we are so pleased for one of those to be CGNews. So we called this chat In Your Shoes because we wanted to talk about life for Muslims in America 10 years after 9/11, and especially how Muslim Americans feel about the commemorations of the 10th anniversary of 9/11. And CGNews received several questions from individuals through Facebook and Twitter that I would like to pose to you now. And I'd like to start with first getting your take on the 9/11 commemorations in the United States, and also to address one question that we had from a reader, which was this: have this year's 9/11 commemorations affected the levels of anti-Muslim sentiment that you have seen in the US?
I think, first of all, it's important to remember that Muslims as well as non-Muslims were killed in 9/11. I think one thing that always comes up every time we do commemorate the attacks is that these were attacks by Muslims against America. And I think many people forget that Muslims died in the Twin Towers and that people from more than 100 countries died in the Twin Towers, and that this was an attack against human beings generally, outrageous and condemned by Muslims across the world, not just Muslims here in the US. But the main concern, I would say, or one of the main concerns for American Muslims is that every year the country is reminded that Muslims attacked America. And that, by extension, then creates a lot of hostility, a lot of suspicion, and this kind of guilt by association for the American Muslim community, when we had nothing to do with those attacks. I might have shared, or I might share, the faith of those men who got onto those planes and crashed them into the 4 different sites on September the 11th, 2001. But it doesn't mean that I share the intention they had when they got onto those planes, and it doesn't mean that I'm responsible for what they did. And of course, I thoroughly condemn it. So what I hope, and I think many Muslims, many American Muslims also hope, is that these are the last commemorations. This 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks would be the last time that we commemorate the attacks, not just so that the American Muslim community doesn't suffer from this guilt by association, but so that we can just end this link between Muslims and this awful attack. And also, to allow the families to move on with their lives, to allow the families to heal, for those who've remarried, for those who've had children, for the children who've grown up of any faith background and of any ethnic background, allow them all to move on, because I think we've reached a state in this country where too many groups have politicized the grief around 9/11. And you saw that very clearly last year with the attacks on the Islamic Community Center that's close to so-called Ground Zero, where we were told as Muslims, you can't have a community center here because you attacked us.
Thank you. And there was another question that came in, which is also linked to 9/11, and that I think builds on what you've just said, which is this: 10 years after September 11th, 2001, do you feel that in the United States you are labeled first as a Muslim or as an American?
Well, I'll answer that question personally and in a way that I hope is more representative of others, not just myself. I know that many people, when they meet me, don't assume I'm a Muslim because they have very specific ideas of what a Muslim woman is. They don't see a headscarf, don't see someone covered in black from head to toe, and they never assume I'm a Muslim. And so it becomes, I call it I often compare it to someone who's gay when they meet someone and they make sure that they introduce into the conversation the fact that they're gay. And so very soon into a conversation with someone I've met or someone new that I meet, I will mention that I'm a Muslim. And, I'll get things like, oh, you don't look like a Muslim, you don't sound like a Muslim, all this stuff, because I know they have preconceived ideas of what a Muslim woman especially should be. I know that if I wear a headscarf like my sister or my sister-in-law, my sister's doing a PhD in the Midwest, my sister-in-law is an OBGYN physician also in the Midwest, and I know that they wear their faith in a much more visible way than I do. And so for them, of course, the first thing people see is Muslim, and the only thing people see is Muslim. And for Muslim men, say someone who, again, the stereotype for Muslim men is that they'll have a beard. But sadly, and completely unfairly to Muslims and non-Muslims, this idea of who looks like a Muslim and who doesn't has also extended to the fact that the first attack against someone perceived to be a Muslim after 9/11 was against a Sikh taxi driver because he had a beard and he wore a turban. And to the person attacking him, he looked like Osama bin Laden. So, this is how ridiculous and this is how unfair it is when guilt by association is just extended across a whole group of people who, quote, unquote, look like Muslims. So yes, many people in this country are labeled Muslims first. But one of the reasons that I became an opinion writer, and on 9/11, I say 9/11 ended my news career and began my opinion writing career, is because I wanted to fight these preconceived notions. And especially so since my nieces and nephews were born, because they were the first Americans in my family. They were born in this country. They're between the ages of 3 and 8. And I want them to grow up in a country that doesn't ask them to choose between being American and Muslim, but fully accepts them as being American and Muslim and doesn't demand that they choose either or.
And a few other questions came in that dealt with how Muslims perceive their own lives in the United States, or how the United States perceives them, and also getting into the question of legal rights. So one question was, 10 years after 9/11, with Guantanamo still open, with Muslims being detained without a trial, do you feel that Muslim Americans have the same rights as non-Muslim Americans? And so just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
The day after the September 11 attacks, then President George W. Bush went to a mosque and very correctly said, we should not use this as a reason to attack Islam or to hold Muslims all guilty by association. But unfortunately, he and his administration then proceeded to do exactly that by invading 2 Muslim majority countries, by opening Guantanamo and filling it with hundreds of Muslim men who were kept there, and many continue to be kept there without trial, without charge, without trial, and by detaining hundreds of other Muslim men here in the mainland USA for the slightest of violations, and many were deported. So when it came to being a Muslim after 9/11, yeah, legally, many Muslims were on very shaky ground. But, and this is where those of us, this is where it's important to understand your legal rights. Whether it was the American Civil Liberties Union or Muslim civil liberties groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations, or individual Muslims who are either attorneys or who made it a point to understand their rights. At the end of the day, there is a legal system in this country that must apply to everybody equally, regardless of their faith background, regardless of their ethnic background. So even though these terrible violations happened, Muslims could then go to the legal system, to a court, to an attorney, and have them take on their case. In the case of Guantanamo, it's been much more difficult, obviously. But I know that groups like the ACLU and the Council on American Islamic Relations have fought successfully to defend the rights, say, of Muslim women who were fired just because they were wearing a headscarf. And CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, even though that group and myself share very little in the sense of our ideological positions, they're much more conservative than I am. I salute them, efforts that they have put into defending rights of, say, Muslims who were denied the right to take off a few minutes from work to pray. And so my point is, there is a system in this country that every American and non-American can apply, can resort to. After 9/11, it was more difficult for non-Americans to resort to that system. But if this country wants to continue priding itself in a respect for human rights and wants to continue to lecture other countries about the importance of human rights, then it must maintain that legal system and make it imperative that regardless of your faith and ethnic background, you have an equal position in front of the law.
And you spoke earlier about stereotypes, and we had a couple questions come in that dealt with perceptions and perhaps with misperceptions. So one question was related to the idea of Sharia, which has come up so much in the news just in the past year. And the question is, what percentage of Muslim Americans live under strict adherence to Sharia law? How might you unpack that question?
You know, the fact that someone even asked that question and even put all those words together in the same sentence just shows you just how ludicrous this Sharia creeping, crawling, whatever conversation has become. There are no Muslims in this country who live under Sharia. American Muslims live under the American Constitution. American Muslims live under American law. American Muslims are not calling for the application of Sharia. American Muslims are very happy to live under the Constitution of this country. The fact that a state like Oklahoma and I think Michigan now are racing to put legislation into place to prevent anyone from using Sharia is an example of the politicization of this idea that Muslims are guilty of something. Last year, this whole no Sharia in America madness came about in the run-up to the elections. It came about in that atmosphere that had people yelling at Park 51, the Islamic Community Center close to Ground Zero. And it came about in the most ludicrous of circumstances where you had people running for Congress and the Senate making ludicrous claims such as Dearborn, Michigan is living under Sharia law. And that is just ridiculous. Dearborn, Michigan is a US city that lives under the US Constitution. So my simple answer after having said all of that is there is no Sharia in the United States. I am subject to the US Constitution and the US law. And nobody I know in this country wants Sharia to be applied. We're very happy with our legal system as Americans.
And we had another question that came in about extremism that would also be interesting to unpack. So this question is based on a figure from a 2011 survey by the Pew Research Center, which found that 5% of Muslim Americans view Al-Qaeda favorably. And so someone who had read this survey asked, what percentage of the 5% of Muslim Americans who view Al-Qaeda favorably are radical extremists? How would you respond to that question?
It's interesting to me that they picked up on this 5% of American Muslims support Al-Qaeda, because I would have said 95% of American Muslims don't support Al-Qaeda. I mean, this is the news here. The majority of American Muslims do not support Al-Qaeda. And this is something that we should celebrate and we should be proud of. If you look at any community, you will find that a small minority of that community has radical leanings. If you look at the Christian right, if you look at the separatists, if you go to Oregon and you look at the anarchists, if you look at any group in this country, actually any group across the world, you will find that a small minority of them are very radical. And so Muslims, just like anybody else, will have a small group that is very radical. So it's not even a question that I honestly believe is worth getting into. That 5% is a tiny, tiny group of American Muslims. The story here is a majority of American Muslims do not support Al-Qaeda. That majority of American Muslims is law-abiding. That majority of American Muslims have not committed any crimes. And if a Muslim has committed a crime, he or she should stand trial, as Nidal Hassan, I think he's a major in the US Armed Forces, who opened fire on his fellow servicemen and women. What he did was atrocious. What he did is a crime, and he should stand trial for it, as any American should stand trial if they open fire, whether that American is attacking an abortion clinic because he or she belongs to the tiny minority of Christians who believe that abortion is a sin, or whether it's a Muslim who belongs to that tiny minority of Muslims who believe Al-Qaeda is doing something good. But at the end of the day, for the majority of Muslims across the world, not just in the United States, Al-Qaeda symbolically died many years ago. Osama bin Laden symbolically died for Muslims many years ago when he was actually physically killed earlier this year in Pakistan by US forces. His physical death finally caught up with his symbolic death. And a clear example of that is to watch what's been happening in the Middle East and North Africa, where you've seen men and women rising up against dictatorships, against regimes, many regimes which are supported by our administration here in the United States. But people have been rising up against them non-violently and peacefully, and not using the Al Qaeda's ideology